Okay, we're here to talk about which foods might be chametz, and we're going to go through many examples of things that could be chametz. Really, we're going to try to stay away from the shilas that throw out so many of these foods, and a lot of them you're going to pass. You say, of course, you're allowed to eat that, which I'll accept that. And you can talk, you can scream and complain if you want. But the goal here is just to show why foods could be chametz. Okay, and when we open up and we say to somebody, they ask, is this chametz? And we look in the book and it says, yes, it is, or it needs a hashgacha on it, just to get a better understanding of why is that? What should be about that?
Oh my God, I feel like I know it's in the meeting.
Okay, why it could be chametz, etc. That's what we're trying to explain. And as we're going to see, sort of towards the beginning, even though many of these foods could be made chametz, the bulk of these foods, as we see will go on, are in fact not chametz. Okay? In fact, the most likely what most of these things are just kidneys, and we'll talk about that a little bit. We're really not going to talk about chametz and kidneys. We're just trying to, but these are foods that could be chametz and why they could be chametz. Okay, in way back when, 100 years ago, everybody knew what chametz was. Okay, it was very easy. Okay, everyone could look at their foods. We know what makes things chametz. There are 5 grains: wheat, rye, spelt, oats, and barley. If those 5 grains sit in water for 18 minutes, the food becomes chametz. So it was pretty easy to figure out which things were chametz. Okay? If you had bread and cookies and crackers and pizza and pasta, all these foods, you picked up farina, pizza, all those foods.
100 years ago?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Okay, so all of these. Okay,
Nice.
so we're going to do the first section is going to be the basic foods that are chametz. Okay, and we know the 5 grains mixed with water makes chametz. There's another thing we're going to talk about a little bit later, possibly, and that's called sour, okay, sourdough. We're going to talk about that in a second. But basically, that chametz is these 5 grains mixed with water, sits for 18 minutes, and it becomes chametz.
You have anything on oats?
We'll get to that. We'll get into it in a second. Okay.
Wow.
Okay. This is all this doing. Okay.
I didn't do it.
Okay. Well, he just pointed us out to this interesting tool. Helps it more interesting to look at than just to listen to me. Okay. So in our, I already told you a whole slew of things that could potentially be, that would be obviously chametz. Okay. And you know those, and they knew those 100 years ago. Okay. Farina, everybody knows. You mix wheat with water and mix it into chametz. Okay.
If you wait 18 minutes.
If it sits for 18 minutes, correct. Now, I did not want to do that. Okay, we're at it. Okay, we're going to go back to that one. Things that are less obviously chametz. Let's go through something that are less obviously chametz, but are still within the range of what would be most people would recognize. The first one is flour. Okay? Flour, and the way we process flour is similar to the way they've done it for 1,000 years, but the way we process flour is the grains are moistened and sit moist for many hours before they grind them, before they remove the outer layers. And the reason why they do it is that moisture helps remove the bran on the outside of the flour. And therefore, before they remove that bran, they moisten it and it sits in water. It's a halachic question, how chametz it is, but we would treat regular flour that you buy in a bag of flour in your house as at least a suffix of chametz, at least possibly that thing is chametz because it came in contact with water. It came in contact with water and sat there for many hours in that way. Okay, another example is, I used the word before, sourdough. Sourdough is, the way you bake bread is you have flour and water and yeast. Okay, well, where do you get yeast from? So nowadays we use yeast, we scoop it out of a little container, or we rip open a package. Okay, but the traditional way to get yeast is flying around in the air. It's all over the place. And if you mix flour and water together, with time, enough yeast will come to there that it will start to ferment. What the bakers would do, and bakers still do it today, is every day after they knead a batch of dough, they would take one glob of it, put it on the side, usually behind the oven, where it's nice and warm, and it would sit for 24 hours. The yeast that was in there would multiply. So by tomorrow, this ball of dough was now a ball of yeast. Okay, the yeast. No, that's not that. And it tastes awful. That's why it's called sourdough. It has a very sour taste to it. And that's chametz also. Even though it tastes awful, that stuff is chametz also. So that sourdough is chametz. Okay?
You're right.
Yeah, that says in the Torah, you can't eat chametz or sour. This is called sour. Okay? That's not yeast. We're going to talk about yeast. What we call yeast, we'll talk about it a little bit later. But that's what sourdough, that's also chametz. Okay, oats. most grains are, in order to store a grain, you just dry it out and you put it away. Let's say barley, we'll get to it in a second. Take barley, wheat, you want to keep it, you let it dry out, and it will store forever and ever. Oats is different than that. Oats, if you put them away, they will spoil. So before you put them away, you need to deactivate an enzyme that's in the oat. You do that with heat. If you do that with dry heat, that's fine. It doesn't make anything chametz. It doesn't make any difference. But if you do it with moist heat, then it potentially makes the oats chametz. Okay? You're adding moisture into those oats.
Some moisture like steam? Or
Steam. Mm-hmm. Then it runs into questions, for your interest, a question of something called chalita. There's a process of using heat and moisture that doesn't make chametz. It runs into that question. But we would assume that if it came in contact with moist heat, then it is chametz. There's no way that anybody would know whether the oats in their house had a wet process or a dry process. So we treat oats as chametz. Okay? A variation of regular oatmeal like you have in your house is something called colloidal. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Colloidal oatmeal, which is really very finely ground oatmeal mixed with basically nothing like perfumes and other things like that. But it's very finely ground oatmeal. It's used as a pain reliever. It relieves itchiness. People who have different kinds of itching problems take baths with it. It's in cream. You take it in a bath. That's correct. When you in a hand cream, it's completely not edible. When you use it in a bath, it runs into a very different question, which is not for now. Which is, it's really just ground up oatmeal. It's really, you could put it into your blender, and if you could grind it that finely, it's the same thing. It really just, it has some. So that potentially is chametz, and you may not be able to take a bath with it because if you haven't benefited from it, you haven't enough. Okay.
But in your hand cream, you're not getting
in bath, in your hand cream, it's not edible. It's in a form that's not edible, so it wouldn't be.
Just go through that. What is considered usher by now?
We're not. No. That's not today. That's not today's
That's not for
discussion.
today. Please put on the record.
Okay. Another one is there's a chemical. I'm just going to throw out the name. You'll have heard it once in your life. Furfural. Okay. Furfural is a chemical that's made from oats, or can be made from oats. And
How do you spell it?
Fural.
very good. Okay. And another thing that's made from these are what we call the less obvious types of chametz is called malt or malt syrup. Okay. How do you make malt and malt syrup? You take barley, whole barley grains, and you soak them in warm water, and the grain begins to sprout. The grain says, "Aha, I'm being planted. It's time to start growing." It releases an enzyme, and that enzyme breaks down the starch within the barley grain. And what happens is the barley goes from tasting sort of blandish, like barley tastes like, to all of a sudden tasting very sweet. It's breaking down the sugars. We're going to talk about that a little more in a second. It breaks down the starches into these sugars that have a very sweet taste to them. So we're going to talk more about how people use malt in a second, but one simple way that people use it is something called malt vinegar. Okay, there's a malt vinegar, and that's one thing that people use it. We're going to get more to malt a little in. We'll get more to that in a second. Okay. Now, before we close this, I have to tell you something, that's what the slide was about before, and that is, we all know that for Pesach we would look, if we would see something called starch, that would make us concerned. That the thing that we're looking at may be starch made out of wheat. Okay? But this is out of what I apologize to you. Okay, and that is starch. The term starch refers to the starch, a certain part of the material of the grain, but it can come from anything, from many, many different sources. Okay? If you go to Europe, the starch, the grain that they have lots of, that's very available, is wheat. So maybe half of the starch, a very good percentage of those things, of starched things, are made out of chametz. If you go to Europe, and we're going to see as we go on, this is going to play a big role. In the United States, when they need to make something out of starch, they almost never make it out of wheat. They use the wheat to make cookies and bread and pasta. Okay, when they need to make a starch out of something, they do what we have lots of, which is lots of corn. Okay, so we make maize. That's what we make things from starch out of those things. If you go to the Far East, they use rice and sweet potatoes. Okay, that's what they have lots of, and that's what they make their things out of. So, excuse me?
I don't know the sweet potato.
So, no. So that is to say, if I see starch as an ingredient, or if I see maltodextrin, that's a variation of starch. Or I say, on my paper plates, I've heard that there might be starch on paper plates. Okay, it's true that there might be starch in these places, but starch for us in the United States, as a rule, those things that are starch, and many of the things we're going to talk about for the next however long I dabble for, however long I go on for, all those things could be made from any starch. So if we were living in France, we would be much more concerned than if we were living in Chicago. Living in Chicago, when we see something that was made out of starch, or any of these other things that could be made from any starch, all those other things probably are not made out of chametz. Okay, for us, they're probably not chametz. They could be, but most likely that they're kidneys or nothing, or not innocuous. Excuse me? That kidney? So whether the rules for kidneys are very different than the rules for chametz. Okay, so chametz is what we're talking about today. Maybe a different time we'll talk about what we deal with something as kidneys. The concerns are much less serious when it comes to kidneys. Okay, so we're just thinking about what's chametz. So all the things you're going to hear from now on could be chametz. In most of these cases, they're probably not chametz. Okay, for most of the things that we're going to see are most likely going to be kidneys, but they could be, and that's why we're concerned that they might be chametz. Okay, now let's move on. So now we're up to the next category is I missed it. Okay, it's supposed to be didn't work very well. Okay, well this thing that says check the ingredients. Okay, there are many foods that have in them chametz. All you have to do to find that they have chametz is just to look at the ingredient panel. Okay, in other words, I'm not talking about cookies. That obviously cookies are made out of with chametz in them. I'm talking about, I have a whole list here of things.
Tomato sauce.
Make off with that.
No, benefiber. Okay,
Benefiber?
benefiber. Okay,
What is that?
it's a laxative. Okay, it used to be made out of something innocuous. Now it's made out of wheat dextrin. There's only one ingredient. Open the package. You just have to look at it, and you would see in a second that that's what it's made out of. Okay, lots of course, breakfast cereals. But then gloves and balloons. Many of them are lined with powders to them. Okay, so if you knew what the ingredients were, you would know that they have that they potentially have starch in them. As I said, and if I remember, I'll keep repeating it. That starch is probably not chametz where we live. But what's the concern? What's the reason why why we may or may not be concerned? Is because of that. Licorice commonly has wheat in it. It's common that licorice has wheat. It's right down the ingredient panel. It's usually second or third ingredient. And this is a surprise to most people, but matzah, year-round matzah, is treated as chametz. Sometimes it even says on the package just that it's chametz, and that's because not only is it made out of flour, and I had mentioned to you that flour, we treat flour as chametz, but it's a very sophisticated process to make matzah that's not chametz. And they're not paying any attention to that year-round.
Machinery.
When they make them, when they make matzahs all year-round, they're not paying any attention to all these important rules that go into making a real matzah. Okay, I'll run through them. Pet foods. Play-Doh. Play-Doh is made out of what it's made out of, flour and water. Whether it's usher, I'm not talking. That's for a different time.
Tiger or something?
What?
Dog. What's the name of the dog? Dog.
Mickey.
Okay.
Okay, that's for a different question as to whether Play-Doh is usher, but it is. That's my cousin, my nephew. Yeah, well, it's a niece.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It's a female. Okay. And then soup mixes lots of them have flour in them, and then as you may or may not know, soy sauce is made of soy, of course.
A lot of.
But the two grains are used in them, and the second grain is very often wheat flour.
Sodium.
Okay. So those are a bunch of things that if you would just look at it, if you pick up the package, or if you look at the soy sauce in your pantry, you'll see it says soy, and the next ingredient might say corn, or it might say wheat. Okay, so the wheat's right sitting there, right in front of you, that was made with chametz.
They have finished to pick a soy sauce.
Well, that's not even made out of soy.
Pancakes.
Yes.
Pick a bread.
Mustard.
I'm not talking about whether you could eat this one. I'm really thinking is it chametz? Why does the soy sauce need to be kosher on Pesach? Because soy would be kidneys, but the wheat could be red.
Rabbi Cohen, can I just say one other thing?
Yes.
Also, it's just people who sell chametz gomer, but they won't sell
Yes.
chametz gomer.
Some people
They throw
don't
it
know.
out. But if it's only kidneys, then they'll keep it in there over Pesach.
Okay.
That's what people will call and ask: is it chametz gomer or not? You know.
Okay, so before we close out this section, I'm going to mention three things that, at first glance, you might think they're chametz, but in fact they're not. And those are rye flour, spelt flour, and barley. Okay?
You said spelt flour was 5.
It is, but those three items, rye flour and spelt flour, when you produce them, when you create the flour, they don't use any water in the process. Okay? As opposed to wheat flour, when you do it, they use water to help take off the bran, and rye and spelt, they don't do that when they take off the bran. And barley, or called pearl barley, the same thing, barley is also doesn't use water in the process. So those items are not chametz, even though you would think that they would be chametz.
So your regular barley flour is not.
Not barley. Be barley flour or barley. You have a bag of barley that people use for their chunk, or for their soup. It's sitting in the pantry. It's not chametz.
That's not washed beforehand, didn't it?
Correct.
Washed and pearled?
It's not washed. That's good. It's just pearl. Pearling is a mechanical process that they scrape off the outer layer,
Yeah.
and there's no liquid in the process. So those things are not chametz. So whereas the wheat flour might be chametz, but the barley that you have, if you use rye or spelt flour, those things are not chametz.
Rye or spelt flour. And let's say you have rye seeds. Do they do such a thing?
Rye seed, nothing I'm familiar with.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm just-
Okay, let's move on.
Yeah, but if you have a raw bag of barley, and you sell, you know. No.
Because you keep it in your house for
Let's say
Pesach.
people sell
Now they're chametz.
Okay. Get rid of chametz gummer, right?
Okay.
I see what you're saying.
Okay, so now, the second group we're going to look at is, I had mentioned to you that if you take barley and you soak it in water, you steep it, it gets in warm water, it begins to sprout, it releases this enzyme. And so now we'll talk about two different ways that people use
Malt.
malt. One is, I sort of mentioned in passing, was it's used as a flavoring. Okay, it has a sweet taste to it, and it's used as a flavoring. You might see that in Rice Krispies or cornflakes, cornflake crumbs. It's a lot of these things have it as a sweetener or as a flavoring. It gives a special flavor to it. And you could do something called hydrogenation. Okay, it's not important what that is. It's a chemical process you do to the malt. You do it to the malt, and that turns it from what we call malt into maltitol. Okay, you may have seen that. It's something that I've seen it in chewing gum. Okay, maltitol.
A lot of medicines have it.
In medicines also? Okay, maltitol. So maltitol is made in a malt, and it's chametz. Okay, so something that has that.
A lot of medicines would have maltitol in it. You might have a problem because it comes from barley.
If it would have maltitol, then it would not be good. Yes, that's correct. Okay, so that's how it's being used as a flavoring. In the chewing gum, it's a sweetener. Okay,
And none of this like a sweetener also for instead of sugar?
correct.
So is it low cal?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Another thing is that we would use it as a minor to hydrolyze starches. What does that mean? I told you when you soak the barley in water, it releases an enzyme. That enzyme breaks down the starch that's in the barley into sugars. Okay, starch. I should have a picture of you here. Starch is really hundreds of sugars strung together, and the enzyme that comes out of the barley helps break down that starch from hundreds into smaller pieces. And that's actually why it tastes sweet, because it's in smaller sugar pieces. So what some people do is, instead of letting the enzyme work on the barley and break down the barley, they steal the enzyme. Okay? After the barley releases its enzyme, they remove that enzyme. They take it out of the liquid that's there, and they use that enzyme to hydrolyze other starches. If you want to make
Hydrolyze, if I can.
to break down, to water down, to break down from this long chain of starch into individual sugars.
So what does it do? You soak the barley in hot water.
In warm water, it releases the enzyme.
And that enzyme,
would beta barley beta amylase. Okay?
Okay.
That enzyme would break down the starches, the barley starch. But you hop it, you take it away from it, and you use it to break down something else. Like, if you want to make alcohol out of corn, how are you going to break down the corn? We're going to see what
because if I alcohol corn, it won't come out like barley.
Exactly. It's not going to work as good as barley. So you take the enzyme from the barley, it works really well with barley, you take the enzyme from the barley, put it into your mixture with your corn, and all of a sudden
extracts out the sweetness from there.
it breaks down the starch in the corn and turns it into corn syrup.
And now your corn is hot.
No.
Now, yes, we're going to get that in a second, but yes, then your corn is chametz. But, so, yes, the corn, corn is chametz.
I
Okay, so,
Thinking.
okay, so this is used, where do we see this? So, we're going to talk about it in a second when you make alcohol, okay, but we also use it in the non-dairy milks. Okay, soy milk, rice milk, or almond milk, soy milk, rice. How do you break down the rice and turn it into something that tastes sweet? Okay, rice doesn't taste sweet. We know what rice tastes like. How does it turn into this liquid that's really sweet tasting? Okay, you use an enzyme to break down the rice starch into a rice syrup.
Sugar.
Okay, just like
And
corn
then
syrup.
you can soak it in water and it'll break it. They don't have
Right,
that.
it doesn't work like that. So just like corn syrup is made out of corn and has a sweet taste to it, rice syrup is made out of rice, and you need an enzyme to do that. If you use chametz to do that, you just made your rice chametz.
Is there other ways of extracting the sweetener from the corn without using the barley?
Yes, but this is the traditional and the common, very common way to do it. All the people, there are commercially made enzymes that do it also. But if this is a common way to do it, and in a traditional business like making whiskey, okay, making alcohol, this is a really, very soon. This is a
mash?
No, it's not called mash. Okay, then there's something else.
They had the last show
If you take, another thing is like this. If you take the enzyme that comes out of barley has a very unique way that it breaks down the sugars, and it can create a sugar called maltose. It can create a sugar called maltose. That sugar is just as sweet as regular sugar, but it has a specific property that it doesn't absorb moisture very well. Okay? Who cares? Well, two industries that I've heard of that like that are people who make hard candies. They don't want their candy to absorb moisture, and then they end up being sticky and attach themselves to the wrapper. And ice cream, I don't know what the reason why people who make things that go into ice cream, they don't want it to absorb moisture. Maybe because it gets moisture in the freezer and it gets icy. I don't know what the reason is. They don't want it to, so they like to use maltose as their sweetener, not because it's low calorie, but because it has these special properties that work well for the kind of foods that they want to make. So you would look at a hard candy and you say, what could be with the hard candy? The hard candy, the sugar that's in there wouldn't be, so to speak, regular sugar. It would be maltose, which is, as far as eating-wise, it's just like any other sugar. But as far as chametz-wise, that was made with malt. That was specifically made with the enzyme extracted from malt because it had this special property.
Do you worry about that enzyme all year round? Or that
No. It's not a year-round issue. It's only a chametz issue. Okay, on to our next section. Okay.
Excellent.
On to our next section. Okay. One of the most famous things that people make out of chametz, besides what we mentioned, bread and cookies and things like that, one of the most famous things that people make out of chametz is whiskey. Okay? What we call ethyl alcohol. Okay? So the term ethyl alcohol, it's a technical term, but it shouldn't be confused with other things that that sound like they're the same, like methyl alcohol or butyric alcohol or propanol, or we call it ethanol, but ethanol and propanol are not the same thing. Okay, neither is butanol and methanol. Anything else that ends with OL, the OL term, which means it's an alcohol, has to do with the structure of the chemical structure, how it's set up. And it refers to many things. Those things are not made out of chametz. Those things are not made out of wheat and rye and barley and things like that. Ethyl alcohol can be made out of those grains that we're used to. Okay, so if we just
Finish that sentence. Can be made out of what grain?
Chametz.
any grains. Okay, we mentioned that way back when, you missed it, the circle, which is that you could use many different grains to make these things. It potentially could be chametz, but not necessarily, okay? No, so just whatever, okay. If you'll indulge me for a second, how do you make a fermentation? How do you make an alcohol out of a starch? And what you do is like this.
Starch or grain?
Grain. Well, the starch that's in the grain. Okay. The grains are, the bulk of a grain is starch. Okay. Just for your understanding of it, it's starch. It's there so that the plant can grow. It's nutrition for the plant to grow when it first sprouts.
Sugars for the
plant to go till it can get leaves and roots and things like that going. It's the nutrition to keep it going. As I said to you, the starch is made of these long chains of sugars. You can make, when you make ethyl alcohol, ethyl alcohol is changing over sugar, something called yeast, takes the sugar and converts it from sugar into carbon dioxide and ethyl alcohol. Okay, that's what it does. Yeast is the thing that converts sugar into ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide. How do we get sugar out of the starch? We hydrolyze, like I mentioned before. We break down the starch until it's these individual sugars, and then we put the yeast into it. Okay, any starch that you want to could be used to make this. Okay, you can make alcohol, ethyl alcohol, out of wheat, corn, rice, sweet potato, anything. There's no difference. You can make it. You can also make it out of the sugars that's found in milk, also, and out of wine, and all these other things. Okay, those are Kashrus issues, but you can make it out of anything. So if you want to make ethyl alcohol out of a fruit, fruits have sugars and they don't have starch. Fruits have sugars in them. So you want to make slivovitz, You just take plums. Plums have sugar in them. They don't need to be broken down. And you just put yeast into it, you make it into a liquid, put yeast into it, and it turns into plum alcohol. Okay? But if you want to make alcohol that bourbon and scotch, you use a different grain. Okay? You use different grains, you break them down into sugars, you put yeast into it, and the yeast turns into alcohol and carbon dioxide.
Right.
Okay, so
What's the carbon dioxide purpose?
what's its purpose?
What does it do?
It doesn't do anything. It's a production. If you want to see the formula, I should
Don't
put the formula
separate the
there.
carbon dioxide afterwards.
So if just for your curiosity,
Can't breathe that way.
the reason why beer has carbon bubbles in it is because when you ferment it, when you create the alcohol, the carbon dioxide is in there. The bubbles are in there. It's part of when you make this fermentation.
Carbon dioxide is natural bubbles.
Yeah, the beer companies may add or take out carbon dioxide because they want to have a specific amount, but by nature, yes, it naturally has the carbon dioxide. And champagne naturally
And then
has...
when they make pop, they add the carbon dioxide from an outside source.
Very good.
It's not natural.
Now, so the simple things that you make the ethyl alcohols in is beer and whiskey. Okay, beer and whiskey, beer is made out of barley, and whiskey is made out of all kinds of different grains, and that's a simple thing that we use ethyl alcohol for. Okay, some of the byproducts of making ethyl alcohol are, as our guys just mentioned, one of them is carbon dioxide. Okay, if you're making bourbon, okay, a bourbon company is automatically creating carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Okay, so in some companies that just escapes out into the atmosphere. Other people recover it and they sell that carbon dioxide to Pepsi. Okay, they sell that carbon dioxide to somebody else who needs carbon dioxide for their other
You
beverage.
have to worry about it?
So
Hold on.
halachically, we're not talking about the halacha part of it. That's a question whether
I'm
halachically.
talking about the chametz part of it.
It's a question of halachically that is or is not a chametz concern. Whether the carbon dioxide coming from chametz is a concern,
Right.
but it definitely happens. Okay, next to big ethanol companies, ethanol is like the fuel that we use that people.
Shell has that.
Next to companies that make this into someone recovering it and selling it to the outsiders. Okay, whether it is or is not an issue. Official CRC policy is that we make sure that the carbon dioxide is not chametz. Okay. Okay. Another byproduct is something called brewer's yeast. Okay, brewer's yeast is after you ferment beer. Okay, when you brew beer, the yeast that forms that you use, I forgot if it rises to the top or sinks to the bottom. Okay, but you collect that yeast, and that has whatever properties it has to. I know that I've seen it in potato chips, okay, which is, you wouldn't expect to see it there, but it could be there. I don't know exactly what it's used for.
Brewer's yeast.
Brewer's yeast. I don't.
Probably for the seasoning, so it's stick better.
Maybe it didn't.
Good with the taste.
Oh, it does it? Okay.
In the ingredient.
So I don't know what its role is, but it could be any place. Okay, so brewer's yeast is made out of beer. Okay, brewer's yeast is plain old chametz. Okay, because the beer is, of course, chametz. It's made out of barley.
That's a byproduct of the beer.
Of the fermentation. No, when you ferment it, you create the ethyl
When I
alcohol.
saw, I go through tours, so they say they saved the yeast they brought it from Germany.
Mhm.
That's the brewer's yeast that they use?
Yeah, well, that is to say, they keep a certain amount of it for the next batch of it.
Right.
But some people are selling all or some of it to be used for
They don't
whatever.
need all of it.
Right. Okay. Okay. Now, if after I make ethyl alcohol, I can now do a second fermentation to it. The first fermentation turned the sugar into ethyl alcohol. A second fermentation creates vinegar. Okay? You introduce a different bacteria, not yeast, a different thing. You put that into there, and that turns the alcohol into vinegar. So that's why vinegar is something that's sensitive to Pesach, because it's always made from alcohol, and the alcohol that it's made from could have been chametz. I mentioned to you beforehand, there's something called malt vinegar. That's made from malt alcohol. Then you turn barley into alcohol. The barley, after it turns into alcohol, you ferment it again, and it becomes malt vinegar. Yes.
When I see kosher Pesach white vinegar, apple cider vinegar, I understand would come from apples. Where would this white vinegar, synthetic?
Okay. So white vinegar that we buy, hold it for a second for Pesach. Year round when we buy white vinegar in the United States, that usually comes from corn.
Right.
Someone fermented corn. They purified it to the point that it's basically pure alcohol, and then they fermented it into corn vinegar. In corn vinegar, what we call the white distilled, usually in the United States, usually comes from corn.
So it wouldn't be a problem.
If it was for Pesach,
for sure.
if it would be for Pesach, it wouldn't come from corn. Right? We wouldn't make it.
Potatoes.
It can be made from potato. It can be made from any grain. Any grain that you turn into alcohol could then be turned into made into vinegar afterwards.
So I'm saying, so for a Pesach, you would
Yeah,
either use the potato.
It could be.
Can't use the corns. You can't use any of that,
You
right?
could use sweet potato or tapioca, anything right now.
Bananas.
There is such a thing for the people who work on the commercial side. There is such a thing as glacial acetic acid. Okay, that's a way of making vinegar out of petroleum. Okay, it has nothing to do with food uses. Okay,
Glacier.
glacial acetic acid. It's called that.
Glacial.
It's called that because at room temperature. Because at room temperature, it's ice. Okay, it's frozen. Okay, so that's what's called glacial acetic acid. What?
Would be edible?
If you dilute it in water, it's edible, just like regular vinegar. Yeah,
FDA approves it.
then I don't know. Okay, so what do we know? Lots of foods. Vinegar tends to be in condiments. Okay, in ketchup, mustard, pickles, olives, mayonnaise, dressings, all kinds of things like that. Horseradish, all kinds of things like that have vinegar in them, and they are all therefore sensitive to Pesach. Now, okay, as I said, I don't know how many times. Okay, just because it's sensitive doesn't mean that it's chametz. Living in the United States, chances are that it's not chametz. Chances are that the vinegar that's in your pickle jar is coming from corn. Okay, chances are that it's not chametz, but it's potential for chametz. That's why we won't eat it unless we know that it came from something that's kosher based.
So you would tell someone if they sell chametz, they could keep their pickles in their.
Yeah, they don't. That's correct.
That's important to know too.
Yes. Okay. So now, going just back for a second to ethanol, where would people use ethanol? So I mentioned the simple things it's used as a whiskey. Okay. So right, vodka. Okay, those are the simple things that people use it for. But I guess it's more complicated than that, and that is one is that it goes into all these.
But vodka's not fresh.
Okay.
That is good.
That all kinds of chemicals that we really don't need to talk about the structures, but you may have heard these terms of esters and ketones and aldehydes. Okay, that all the you see ethyl butyrate. Okay, ethyl butyrate. Well, the ethyl part of it came from ethyl alcohol. Okay, came from ethyl alcohol. Now, chances are that it didn't come from chametz, but it could have. Okay, those are all things that are used in flavors. Okay, so when you pick up Coke for Pesach instead of Coke for year-round, the flavor that's in there for year-round may have ethyl-based compound, which is there for chametz. Could be. We don't know. We don't have any idea unless it's kosher Pesach. Okay? Something that maybe strikes more to home, you probably heard this, is you've heard that you shouldn't use decaf coffee for Pesach unless it has some hashgach on it. And the reason for that is because the way they remove the caffeine out of the beans is with something called ethyl acetate. It's a chemical that's one of the ways of removing the caffeine is with ethyl acetate. Okay, so now you're smart enough to know that, well, ethyl acetate there's an ethyl component to that, which could have been made from chametz, which would then be a problem for Pesach. Okay,
Would be a quarantine, will we worry about it?
The chances of it being chametz is very small. Okay, but is it possible? It is, and therefore we don't have
It would be made of kidneys. And
Well,
that's
it. It's a fair question. It would not be problem, but we're not talking about that's not today. Today we're talking about
today, I apologize.
okay. It's
Check
used
the
in
record, please.
it's used in the famous thing that we like to tell people about pecan pieces. Okay, that people use ethanol to float out the pecan pieces. We have this thing that somebody once saw, and therefore we tell people if you have pecan, I don't remember the exact. I think pieces is the one that has the problem, but halves and wholes are okay. Something to that effect. So the problem was because they were using ethanol to wash it off or float it out or something like that. Okay.
Yes.
Then in non-foods, ethanol gets used in non-foods. It's in lots of toiletries. Okay, we know that we talk about mouthwash and deodorants and Purell. Those things have lots of or could have ethanol in them. Okay, whether they're also or not is not our discussion today, but they could have ethyl alcohol in them. Okay, you would see it yourself. Purell alwa's got it. You pick it up, it says it's 60-something% ethanol. And
What's the purpose for it to be in there? What does it do?
in the Purell, that's what
Bacteria.
that's what does the job. That's what's cleaning your hands, disinfecting you.
Oh, no, it's just
Yeah, and
And you drink when you have vodka.
yes, that disinfects the inside. Okay, and as you may know, I think Rabbi Asbach mentioned that you can buy in gasoline also. Okay.
1 second.
Yes.
You're saying
Shell has that.
there are problems
Up to
with this,
I didn't say that it's usher. No, I said that it's made out of ethanol. Okay, it happens to be. If you want to be
it's the longer all you left.
if you want to be into that specific one, as Rabbi Schwartz said, no, it's not edible. But that's not our focus. We're trying to say where could there be potentially chametz in that item. The Purell is made out of 60-something% ethyl alcohol. Okay, that alcohol probably is not chametz, but it could be. It could be a chametz. Okay?
But chametz says only, you can't derive pleasure from it, but you can only not derive pleasure if it's in an edible form.
That's exactly right.
So the same amount of ethyl alcohol in vodka that is in their Purell is not okay. But
Right.
Purell is okay.
The difference is because Purell doesn't just have ethyl alcohol; it has other things in there. The finished item is not edible.
Not at all.
Okay, but that's not for today. But there's specifically things put in it to make it not
Vodka is
edible.
edible.
And vodka, yeah, lots of people think that that's
Yeah, a
edible.
lot of people.
So, if you like it, you like it. Okay.
Any booze has alcohol.
Okay.
It's true.
Okay.
They make a potato batter
Okay.
for Pesach.
Next. Okay, well, we're getting there. We only have one more after this. Okay, next is, I had said to you that you could break down the starch that's in sugar. You can break down the starch into sugars. Okay, break it down from this long starch into individual sugars. Okay, we would call those sugars, in a generic way, we call them glucose. Okay, there are really a number of ways that sugar could be. We'll call it glucose. Okay? So glucose, I have three ways here that glucose could then end up further into foods. Okay? The first one is, I mentioned way back when that the way we make breads is we just mix flour and water and we throw in yeast. Okay, we throw in yeast. That yeast doesn't come from sourdough. Usually that yeast just grows, it's made in a factory. Well, what the factory is doing is that they're taking yeast, the microorganism of yeast, they're feeding it sugar, they're feeding it glucose, and it reproduces itself. Okay? So they're just making more and more of it. Okay? And that's going to be the next bunch of examples I'm going to give you are all the same type of thing. Glucose is used as a fermentation media. It's something that you give to microorganisms, that either they eat it and they reproduce themselves, or they eat it and then they excrete something else that's desirable. Okay? So glucose is the thing that you feed to these microorganisms. Okay? Well, glucose, where does it come from? It doesn't grow in the ground as glucose. Okay? There aren't glucose trees. But glucose comes from all kinds of starches. Corn and wheat and rye and sweet potatoes, rice, all these kind of things are all starches. If you break them down, you end up with glucose, lots of glucose, and that's what you feed to make this thing. So one of them is you can make yeast out of it. Okay? So yeast that's in your pantry was grown typically on glucose, which could be chametz. Is it chametz?
So in America, again, it would be the same you said.
Right. That's probably
they're
not.
probably using, even in Europe, we said starches would come from wheat more because they're more. Glucose would also then come from wheat
Yes,
more.
anything that needs starch, you look around and say, what's cheap? What do we have lots of? So we have, in the United States, you have lots of corn.
So you buy Fleischmann's here in America, made in Milwaukee, right?
Chances are that you're not getting chametz. That's exactly
Okay, that's good.
Okay. Another thing is, lots of enzymes are made the same way. Okay, so the enzyme that you use rennet to make cheese comes like that, or there are enzymes that are used to help extract the juice out of when you're making fruit juice, or the enzyme that makes corn syrup. Okay, when you want to bake corn into corn syrup, all these enzymes are grown on something. They're all grown on glucose. As a rule, they're grown on glucose. That glucose could be, as I just said, it comes from a starch. It could be chametz. Okay, that's what I just walked out. Okay. In bad salads, the reason why we tell people we at least think about whether they need hashgacha for Pesach is because they have citric acid mixed into them. Okay. That citric acid is sensitive because it's a fermentation made out of glucose. Okay. Liquid medicines and light salad dressings have xanthan gum in them. Okay. And xanthan gum is also made by fermentation, which could be made from glucose, potentially made from chametz. The same for MSG, the antibiotics, vitamins. When we make milk that's kosher Pesach, what we're doing is we're making sure that the vitamins put in there are kosher Pesach. What's not kosher Pesach about the vitamins is typically that the vitamins can be grown on chametz. They're grown on a glucose that could be chametz or kidneys based. And then, last for this section is, one of the reasons why people want their meat to be kosher Pesach is because after they shecht an animal, they rinse off the animal with something called lactic acid. It helps decontaminate the animal, remove germs from it. Okay, that lactic acid is made by fermentation. Okay, it could be made from kidneys, usually from kidneys. But it could be made from chametz. So meat that's marked as being kosher Pesach is one of the things they're doing is making sure that lactic acid is not chametz based. Okay, then those are that's what those are. Okay, now you could also do something called hydrogenation to the glucose. And that makes, one of the things that makes is that makes sorbitol. Right? Sorbitol is a sweetener, and it's in lots of toothpastes. There are all kinds of other things. It's a low-calorie sweetener. I'm sorry, I don't know if it's low-calorie. It doesn't encourage cavities to grow, so they use it in toothpaste. Ascorbic acid, if you take sorbitol and you ferment it, it becomes ascorbic acid. That's a vitamin that you might find like in IQF apples.
Which comes from China.
Or if you take sorbitol further, you can make something called polysorbates. Okay, polysorbates are kosher sensitive for the other part of it. Polysorbates are made of ascorbic acid and fatty acids. The fatty acids are the Kashrus sensitive. For Pesach, it's the sorbitol that's sensitive. Okay, and what we ask for here is sometimes glucose is added straight into foods. Okay, straight into foods that you probably wouldn't ever see this. You wouldn't see this on an ingredient panel, but it came up once in Europe. They were adding in glucose into cocoa. And that's the reason why we tell people that cocoa needs hashgacha for Pesach, because there was a company that was adding glucose into their cocoa.
That's not what it says.
It says European cocoa only.
Does it say only from Europe?
It says
Okay.
European cocoa does not need.
No,
No, it says it does need.
Maybe
Okay.
they have forgot the word not.
Okay, so it needs. Okay, we can check it. We can check what it says. We caught a mistake yesterday, so maybe that's a mistake. So we caught a different mistake yesterday. So it
I
has.
think it's prevalent,
It
that
has.
problem.
It's not so prevalent, but it does happen. So, out of concern, people say, "Why would I buy cocoa that may have the chametz into it?" And if it was coming from Europe, we would be much more suspicious that it was chametz thing. And that's why we look for cocoa that's okay.
What is it? It's they put glucose in the powder.
It's a sweetener. I don't remember why that company was doing it. Obviously, they're trying to make money out of it. That's the deal. Glucose is a lot cheaper than cocoa, as you can imagine.
100%.
Okay.
So you're implying that the United States cocoa doesn't need hashgacha altogether?
I don't know. Is that what it says in our book?
Yes.
Mrs. Martin? It doesn't say. It does not need. America. Okay. And I know it says that the Hershey's cocoa is okay. The OU takes care of that. It's always good to tell
Alkaline,
the
not a
people,
problem, just say that.
correct, people to know that these things don't need hashgacha, because you can go buy Hershey's cocoa in any store. You don't need to pay extra for the Pesach version of something if we know it's special Pesach anyhow. So
Always bugging me in stores.
to what? The Pesach
Like the pizza version of Folgers coffee.
Right. Okay.
But some people are very
Okay.
confused.
And last is
Rabbi in the room.
there's some other miscellaneous, we'll call it miscellaneous ways that chametz can get into our food. Okay? And the first is, sometimes the chametz is part of the product. I told you how many times that you ferment things by giving a microorganism some glucose to eat, some sugar to eat. Okay? There's another way to do it. Okay? This is done in Japan, in a product that you've all heard of. Okay? The way they make lactate, the enzyme that's used in lactate is called lactase. The way they make that enzyme is a different method of fermentation it's called koji fermentation. And that is, instead of growing it on glucose, they have it on wheat bran. Okay? It grows on wheat bran. Okay? So the reason why that's chametz, or potentially chametz, is because it grows, that doesn't grow on glucose, that goes in a different way, which would also be problematic, which is that it grows on wheat bran. Okay? And then,
Well, we do have lactate milk that's the same.
we may have some that have hashgacha for Pesach.
Right.
Could be, and that would be they grew the lactase a different way. They made sure they got it in a not chametz way. But why does it need chametz? Where did they come up with this thing that lactate can eat it? And that was the reason.
Lactate pills can you use?
We say you can use it, yes. They might have chametz in the pill, but we think it's not edible, and you could use it for that reason. Okay. Then there are other foods that have chametz mixed into it. You've heard these examples. For example, famous quinoa and amaranth. Okay, those are grains that are not chametz and they're not kidneys. The reason why we tell people to look for it with hashgacha, or we used to have other rules about how to sort it out, is because we're concerned that chametz got mixed in the packaging and in the processing of the product. So it's not chametz inherently, and it doesn't have any way that it was made out of chametz, but we're concerned chametz was mixed into it. Then there's the whole class of low-calorie sweeteners, stevia, aspartame, saccharin, sucralose, all those kind of sweeteners. The reason why we don't recommend them for Pesach is because it could be, some of them could have been made from chametz glucose. That's a possibility for some of them. But that's not the bigger concern. Or that's not the only concern. The other concern is that these sweeteners are so powerful, they're so strong, that people couldn't use them at home if they were making a coffee. You can't put in 3 specks of NutraSweet into your coffee. It doesn't work for people. They need it to be a spoonful. They need a more bulky amount to put into their food. So so what they do is they take these very strong sweeteners and they mix them with something else. Usually it's sugar. They mix it with something they put into there just to give it a sugar or a starch. They just mix it in there just so you can have more bulk. So you can take a spoonful of the stuff or you pour it out of a container to bake with it. But just because the sweetener itself, which is not the chametz part, the sweetener itself is too strong to work with. So when you work with it on a commercial level, when they're making 1,000 pounds at a time, they don't need these other things. They can put in a decent amount. At home, people are going to want to use it in more usable amounts, so they mix other things into it. And that's why they're sensitive to Pesach. That's the better reason why they're sensitive to Pesach. Okay, some other foods that have chametz mixed in is iodized salt. Okay, and there again, it's not the iodine that's the chametz. Iodine itself is too small for companies to work with, even for companies to work with, so they mix that with other things.
So you get non-iodized salt, you're fine.
That's correct. That's what we recommend for Pesach. But just for Pesach, for a week you can handle it. For a week you can.
What do you get?
Okay, back to the meat. Back to the meat. Meat that is sold not the way we buy it, like on a commercial level, in bigger amounts, comes with in these bags called cryovac bags. Those bags can be lined with starch, and they stamp kosher meat. Gets stamped with a certain ink, just to mark what it is, and that ink. It's probably not chametz, probably kidneys, but that also could be chametz in there also. Okay, that stamp that they put onto it, and we hear from our fish how hard it is. They've been really trying to get it kosher Pesach, but they can't. Somehow they can't pull it off. Okay, and lastly is kalim. Okay, a thing can be 100% pure, no chametz, not in any way, which way. But if you made it on chametz stick of kalim, then you can't eat it either. Okay, just so you wouldn't go home now and cook a soup for Pesach in your chametz pots. Okay, so when somebody buys canned fruit or baby food in a jar, the baby food is just carrots. Okay, there's nothing else in it, it's just pure carrots. Oh, but right beforehand they might have cooked oatmeal in there. Okay, in other words, it's the same kalim, or who mentioned? Rabbi Esmach mentioned about apple cider vinegar. It's made out of apples, made out of apple juice. And let's assume, it's not necessary, but let's assume that in its production there was no chametz added in. Mm-hmm. There are ways actually that it could have been, but let's assume there was no chametz added into it. But it was made on the same, it's processed together with malt vinegar. Or with vinegar that would be chametz, and that's where it could run into problems.